I went from living like monks, living out back of the trunk. The pockets are fat with the monks, pockets are fat like the clubs. Now I am living like Trump. Now I am living like Trump. Mimosas and mimosas, mimosas and mimosa, mimosas and mimosa, the Morris Costa Nostra. Pulling up in Testarossa, we charging the debt, discharging the debt, discharging the debt, we charging the jet. Swipers on deck, ciphers on deck, ciphers on deck, wipers on deck, wipers on deck. My life is on check, my life is on check, my life is on tubes, my life is a Jew, my life is on you. My wife is on two, my wife is on two. I'm going for 3, you know it is me. Bread is the pillar, the jet is my pillar, the fez is the killer, the bread is gorilla, the flow is Godzilla, the lizard a beast. I visit the priest, and tell him my sins. I tell him I'm twin, I tell him I'm him, I tell him I'm him. High majesty, high as can be, I am a mountain.
Peace, family. Welcome to another episode, Underground Railroad Productions. This your host, Brother Rich. Now I'm back with Stream Master Gano Grills, man. Welcome back, brother.
Thank you, King. Always good to be here on Black Railroad, you know what I mean? Underground Railroad, it's beautiful.
Indeed, man. Listen, I was watching. Now you haven't been on here in a little while. You appear to be busy. You have these seminars or these conferences, and they look amazing, man. I was on your channel, Galacticus.
Galacticus, yes.
Yeah, on YouTube.com. And they look interesting, man. Yeah. And you advertise on the platform in the beginning of the videos, and you were saying some interesting stuff, and hopefully we could touch on a few of those topics today.
Sure.
Because I'm definitely curious to see what you're out there, with these huge seminars with these people. Talk to me a little bit about what's your purpose with these seminars. When Gano Grills have these seminars in Atlanta, overseas, what's your purpose, brother, with spirituality in these conferences?
Okay, the purpose and the imperative of what I do is to expose people to something that they have not been taught, or things that are arcane, which means occult or hidden for most people. Sacred knowledge, divine knowledge, to give people empowerment, enlightenment, or place them on a path of enlightenment, enrich their lives, and expand their consciousness by and large.
Indeed. So, several terms you were mentioning, kind of interesting. Doppelganger.
Yes.
Talk to me about what is a doppelganger, brother. What is that? What is that?
A doppelganger is literally a physical replication of your corporeal body. It would actually be a real generated twin of who you are, your consciousness, your DNA, everything. If you could split yourself in half. And I believe Michael, what's the guy's name? He did a movie called Multiplicity years ago, the guy that played Birdman.
Okay.
Michael something. But that was an example of what a doppelganger looks like. And there are certain masters on the planet, and certain gurus and higher ranking spiritual beings on the planet that know how to do that. If you go back and research in history, there was a man named Padre Pio, and he produced several doppelgangers of himself. He produced higher versions of a doppelganger that were able to appear to people in air. And during World War II, there were German pilots that reported that they saw a man that was cloaked and pleading with them not to drop those bombs. And lots of them reported the same thing. And they basically adhered to what his plea was. There was also a man named Sheikh Ahmadou Bamba, who was a Muslim Sufi, a Muslimun. And he was reported to being in 7 different places at the same time. So this is something that's possible when people are trained how to apply mysticism into what it is that they do. A doppelganger is a very powerful usage of what's possible with spiritual acumen.
So when you say train, what type of training is this? Like
Training is really
like meditation, like.
Well, meditation is one form of increasing your level of focus spiritually, but being trained, it's like, okay, so just to give you an example, you have people in the ghetto that play football. You know, kids grow up in different leagues and they play football and they can play different positions. But at a certain point, if someone wants to become part of the NFL, they have to be ushered in. They have to go to training camp. They have to be trained in rigorous different drills that they do in order to play on a professional level. So being able to do things spiritually that are very different, it takes that level of training. And of the training mechanisms are pretty sacred. So there's certain lifestyles that basically have to be lived in order to get to a point where you can produce a doppelganger of yourself and lots of other things.
Indeed, indeed. So I guess like the lifestyle, I guess food would be one of the things that you would have to change. Is that something you would have to change? Like the way we eat in order to...
Food is helpful. Food is helpful because, you know, you are what you eat. So, you know, when someone has a lot of sugar in their diet and they're eating pork and lots of heavy carnage, that does definitely impede the abilities of what you're able to do. But at a certain point, when you become a master and you can change the molecular structure of the food itself,
right.
You can eat whatever you want. And that's pretty far and in between. So diet does play a great part in what people are able to perceive. Perception is everything. So when people are eating foods that have heavy loads of darkness to it, it basically blocks the mechanics of what the third eye is able to perceive.
I'm not sure if we talked about this before. We might have, but like I mentioned, you know, this is the YouTube era. This is the era, Google era, where everybody does the research on their own, on YouTube, on Google, on, you know, all these social media networks. And this topic, you talk a lot about Kundalini energy. Is there any dangers of attempting to raise this by just watching a video? Because everybody's like, you know, learning on their own, teaching themselves. They're not, you know, the churches aren't packed like how they used to be. The Freemasonic halls aren't packed like they used to be. A lot of organizations aren't packed like how they used to be, because people are learning all these things on their own. So are there any dangers with, I'm in my room, I want to raise my Kundalini, I just watched the hour video and I'm going to attempt to do it on my own? Is that something you would not recommend?
It's something that I definitely would not recommend, for the simple fact that the analogy would be, I'm looking across at some electrical boxes. So there are people that are on YouTube that give a lot of, you know, videos for dummies out there, and that's fine to a certain degree. But when you're dealing with the divine energy of the Kundalini, it is something that should be handled by a master, in the way that if you were going to change the electrical current of what your house is able to function on from AC to DC, you might want to have an electrician come in and make that configuration. Even if I watched a YouTube video, that is not something that I would attempt to do on my own. Now we're dealing with the electricity of the body, that is your divine birthright. And there are many people who have destroyed their consciousness by attempting to do things that you know, they're not really taught how to do things safely. So it's not something that I recommend. There are people out there, like I remember, you know, I hope Bobby doesn't get mad at me, but Bobby Hemmett said something years ago about you can initiate yourself into, you know, Ifad and certain other things. I've never heard of anything like that. So when you put things out there like that, you can do a self-initiation. It doesn't really have the ashe of the gods, and it's not something, you know, if you don't know how to comport yourself with the gods and higher beings who these energies belong to, it's not something that you can just self-proclaim, because that would be basically idiotic, and people do that out of their own naivete every single day.
I was watching, it's funny you mentioned American Gods, and I was watching it. Have you seen it on F? Yeah, very, very interesting show. The question I want to ask you, since you mentioned gods, and you know, there's people out there who said, you know, you could initiate yourself and things of that nature. Are we older than the gods? Some people say the gods were created by us. when we lost knowledge of self, we started worshiping them instead of instructing them. So, you know, in a movie they had like the god of Easter, they had all these gods that were losing power because they were no longer being worshipped, and the people forgot, like, you know, there was new gods being born at that time, like the internet, the web, and things, that the television, social media. Talk to me about gods and our soul, our primordial soul, and is it older than these gods that we have in these systems such as Ifa, Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, all these religions?
Okay, that's a really deep question, and the way that I would approach that would be to say, now let's say we're dealing with the template of American gods, which is, it's a fictitious account, but it does have a lot of truth in it. And the human consciousness is nowhere near the age of the gods. The gods are, but then again, it depends on the pantheon that you're talking about, because gods is a generality, but there are different kinds of gods. There are ultra gods that are older than eternity itself. And then there are younger gods that might be the Orisha, that aren't as old as some of maybe the Kemetic gods or the Neteru. So with that being said, there are complex thought forms that have been created, and I don't want to call any names, but let's just say people go to church and worship these complex thought forms that have been created as a mechanism for people to usurp, take that energy and use it for their own. These complex thought forms are being prayed to, and that is something that's been generated malefically. They're not real. So when you look at a movie or a TV show like American Gods, and it talked about the Mexican Jesus and this kind of Jesus, those are all created by humans who've been taught that Jesus Christ, Jesus the Messiah, Jesus of Nazareth, Jesus of, or all of these different kinds of Christoses are real beings. And they become real because they have been prayed to so much. In terms of other gods losing power, there is a mechanism that sometimes there are certain gods that have set themselves up to be worshipped. And when that worship begins to fall away, that's not the only thing that could make them lose power. That's a mythos. Gods have, or certain gods have, an energy source of their own, and they're able to sustain themselves. They don't need to be worshipped. The gods that are worshipped are known, but there are lots of gods that humans have never even been taught about. Even in our antiquity, when we had 1.4 million volumes worth of information, divine edicts, and papyrus in the pyramids of the School of Alexandria. Even the Vatican doesn't have that information. So there are many different kinds of exalted beings in the universe. God is a blank, it's a broad stroke that describes a specificity of one kind of God. It doesn't tell you what kind of God that is.
Indeed, indeed. In terms of church, one thing I heard you mention in your seminars, it was either you or a female was talking about speaking in tongues in church. Now, this is something that everybody has always been curious about. Majority of the people that are not part of that church or the whole church system thinks is BS. They're like, man, these people are full of it. They're up there, they got the Holy Ghost, they start dancing, they start screaming, they shouting, they talking this language nobody never heard of before. What's going on when people say they're speaking in tongues? Is something really spiritual happening, or is this just a figment of something they created in their imagination to get them closer to God? What's going on at that point?
You know, speaking in tongues is a very